Thank you. I'm just going to share my screen with you. Lovely. Let's move that out of the way. Okay. So, did Jesus rise from the dead? Well, we're going to go to 1 Corinthians 15, and we're going to start with the first 4 verses. Moreover, brethren, I declare unto you the gospel which I preached unto you, by which also ye have received, and wherein ye stand, by which also ye are saved, if ye keep in memory what I preached unto you, unless ye believed in vain. For I delivered unto you, first of all, that which I also received, how that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, and that he rose again the third day according to the Scriptures. So, what is the gospel, brothers and sisters? What is the gospel? I declare unto you the gospel which I preached to you. He's sort of reminding them, he's putting it sort of before them again. What is the gospel? Well, the gospel is there in verses 3 and 4. For I delivered unto you, first of all, that which I also received, how that Christ died for our sins, according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, and that he rose again the third day, according to the Scriptures. The gospel, the good news, is the New Testament's historic claim that Jesus rose from the dead. This is the gospel, or the good news, according to Paul here. And indeed, the other New Testament writers, this is good news. This is the good news. This is the heart of it. The resurrection of Jesus is central to everything the New Testament says about Jesus. It validates his teaching, it validates his life, and of course, it validates his claim to be the Son of God. So if Jesus didn't rise from the dead, then, all of this is pointless. That's the point that Paul makes in verse 17 there. If Christ be not raised, your faith is vain. You are yet in your sins. Okay? The reason why this is good news, as verse 17 is implying, is that because Jesus rose from the dead, we can have a relationship with God through him. That barrier that existed between us and God has been removed, it's been done away with. And the other thing, verse 20, but now is Christ risen from the dead and become the firstfruits of them that slept. We can look forward to being raised from the dead when Jesus returns, according to verse 20. Okay, so the idea of Jesus' resurrection, the claim, not the idea, the claim that Jesus rose from the dead is right at the heart of the New Testament. If Jesus didn't rise from the dead, then, the New Testament is invalidated. It's as simple as that. We may as well go do something else or go and join the local synagogue down the road. The resurrection of Jesus Christ is the central claim of the New Testament. And the other reason why it's important, we've mentioned the fact that we can have a relationship with God through Jesus, verse 17, and that Jesus is the first fruits of them that slept. But if we go down in 1 Corinthians 15 down to verse 25, it will lead inevitably, when Jesus returns, to the establishment of God's kingdom, and that Jesus will in the end destroy death itself. Sin is the real pandemic. That's the thing that you can't be inoculated against. But Jesus will destroy death. Sin is the real pandemic. Okay, so did Jesus rise from the dead? What does rising from the dead mean? What does the resurrection actually mean? Well, if we go to Luke 24, we have this interesting record, verse 36. But as they thus spake, Jesus himself stood in the midst of them and said to them, peace be unto you. But they were terrified and affrighted and supposed they'd seen a spirit. But he said unto them, why are you troubled? And why do thoughts arise in your hearts? Why are you trying to rationalize this? Behold my hands and my feet, that it is I myself. Handle me and see. For a spirit hath not flesh and bones, as ye see me have. It's interesting that Luke includes this incident to explain that when Jesus rose from the dead, Jesus himself was careful to make the point that he was not a ghost or a spirit. There it is in verse 39. He wasn't a spirit. It's really me, the person you knew. That's the point that Jesus is making. And then, in later on in this passage, he asks for something to eat, just to underline the point. Resurrection is a strangely, peculiarly physical thing. Okay, and this view that the Bible has of the resurrection of the body, I think, is different really to most of what the other churches teach. They believe in dying and going to heaven, but this is about physical resurrection of the body. It's a strangely biblical thing. Okay, so can we corroborate the New Testament's claim that Jesus existed, that he was crucified, and that he rose from the dead? This is the heart of the issue, isn't it? Did Jesus rise from the dead? Can we corroborate the New Testament's claim? We sort of, we've looked at Corinthians. We can see that this is central to everything that the Bible, the New Testament teaches. We've seen Jesus in Luke 24 make the point to his disciples that it really was him. He wasn't a spirit. He was a physical, embodied person. But can we corroborate the New Testament's claim that Jesus existed, that he was crucified, and that he rose from the dead? It would be good to get confirmation from a source outside the Bible. And here it is. Here it is. A Jewish source called the Babylonian Talmud. The Talmud, as my note says there under the title, is a record of rabbinical discussions about Jewish law, biblical interpretation, ethics, customs, and history. But it says this: on the eve of the Passover, they hanged Yeshu, Jesus, and an announcer went out in front of him for 40 days saying, he's going to be stoned because he practiced sorcery and enticed and led Israel astray. Anyone who knows anything in his favor, let him come and plead in his behalf. But not having found anything in his favor, they hanged him on the eve of the Passover. Okay, so quite clearly, this is a Jewish source. It's hostile to Jesus. And, there are a series of claims here which are interesting. But it's interesting how this actually, if you think about it, runs in parallel with what the New Testament actually says. So let's just think about that for a moment. The Babylonian Talmud demonstrates that Jesus was a real person. He was a real historic person. It doesn't say, the Christians invented this person called Jesus. It says he was a real historic person. It also underlines and confirms the point that the Jewish authorities were hostile to Jesus, that Jesus was actually put on trial for a capital offense. That means you could be killed. Jesus was put on trial for a capital offense. You could be killed if you were found guilty. That he was accused of sorcery, which is interesting. Again, that suggests that, they were aware of Jesus's power, that Jesus had this power, that they accuse him of sorcery. They accuse him of false teaching. And finally, if we just go back to the quote again, on the eve of the Passover, they hanged Yeshu, and an announcer went out in front of him for 40 days, saying he is going to be stoned because he practiced sorcery and enticed and led Israel astray. Anyone who knows anything in his favor, let him come and plead in his behalf. But not having found anything in his favor, they hanged him on the eve of the Passover. So that final point is that the Babylonian Talmud actually betrays an anxiety about the fairness of the legal process that Jesus was subject to, which I think is which I think is very interesting. Okay. It betrays an anxiety about the fairness of the legal process by which Jesus was accused, found guilty, and put to death. And I'd like to suggest that all of that actually, rather than being, we shouldn't regard this as being problematic. We should just sort of think, okay, well, actually, this runs in parallel with what the New Testament claims. For instance, Matthew chapter 26 and verse 57. And they that had laid hold on Jesus led him away to Caiaphas, the high priest, where the scribes and the elders were assembled. So Jesus was arrested. Well, Peter followed afar off onto the high priest's palace and went in and sat with the servants to see the end. Now the chief priests and the elders and all the council sought false witness against Jesus to put him to death. Yes, this is not, radically different to what the Babylonian Talmud is saying. It is saying that Jesus was, that the authorities were hostile to Jesus. So the Babylonian Talmud runs in parallel with the New Testament. New Testament claims about Jesus, but, and this is the important difference, it brings into question this apparently outrageous claim in verse 59 here, that Jesus was deliberately denied justice by the Jewish authorities in a sham show trial. Okay? The chief priests, the elders, and all the council sought false witness against Jesus to put him to death. That's the point issue, isn't it? Okay? The Babylonian Talmud is saying that, Jesus had an ample opportunity to clear his name, or his name could have been cleared by anyone. But this is quite different, really, to what the New Testament is saying. That the Jewish establishment closed ranks and basically wanted to end Jesus, wanted to put him to death. So there are these two very different claims. The New Testament is claiming that Jesus was denied justice. The Babylonian Talmud is claiming that Jesus had ample opportunity to clear his name. But we need to interrogate Matthew 26 and the New Testament really on this point. We need to critically interrogate this to see whether what Matthew and the other gospel writers are saying could possibly be true. Because this, when you think about it, is quite outrageous, really, to claim the authorities, subverted, Jesus's trial. And, we'll come back to that point in a moment. But there is another, the problem with Matthew is that there's another difficulty here. Deuteronomy chapter 17, verse 6. At the mouth of 2 witnesses or 3 witnesses shall he that is worthy of death be put to death. At the mouth of 2 witnesses or 3 witnesses shall he that is worthy of death be put to death. But at the mouth of 1 witness he shall not be put to death. The hands of the witnesses shall be first upon him to put him to death, and afterward the hands of the people. So thou shalt put the evil away from you. Okay, so Matthew's claim is further, the difficulty behind Matthew's claim is further compounded by this, I'd like to suggest. Jewish legal principles, basically, the basis of Jewish jurisprudence was that the job of the court was to ensure the rights of the defendant were not violated, okay? It was the witnesses who were in effect the prosecution. At the mouth of 2 witnesses or 3 shall he that is worthy of death be put to death. The hands of the witnesses should be upon him. It was the job of the witnesses were the prosecution. The job of the court, and in particular the Jewish high priest, was to act as Jesus's defense and cross-examine the witnesses to see whether they were actually telling the truth, not Jesus. Okay? So we can see that, Matthew, and indeed the other gospel writers, could be regarded as being problematic when we think about the underlying principles behind Jewish law. Okay. Matthew chapter 26, verse 62. And the high priest arose and said to Jesus, answerest thou nothing? What is it which these witness against thee? But Jesus held his peace. And the high priest answered and said unto him, I adjure thee by the living God, that thou tell us whether thou be the Christ, the Son of God. Jesus said unto him, Thou hast said. Nevertheless, I say unto you, hereafter shall ye see the Son of Man sitting on the right hand of power and coming in the clouds of heaven. The high priest rent his clothes, saying, He hath spoken blasphemy. What further need have we of witnesses? Behold, now you have heard his blasphemy. So it's really interesting, isn't it? What further need have we of witnesses? What we see in practice, according to Matthew, is an astounding breach of legal protocol, with the high priest acting as Jesus's prosecutor by asking Jesus a leading question that he knew would incriminate him. Okay, so why is any of this important? The question is whether the New Testament claims about Jesus are credible. That's the point, isn't it? Is the claim by the Babylonian Talmud that Jesus was legally given the opportunity to clear his name more credible than the New Testament's assertion that he was put to death as an innocent man? Why would responsible authorities behave in the way that the New Testament claims? Would authorities do that? Well, I think we've seen over the last 20 years that actually authorities are quite capable of doing that. But why would they do that? Well, they did that because of this, because of what John says, what John records, John chapter 11. Then gathered the chief priests and the Pharisees' accounts and said, What do we? For this man does many miracles. If we let him thus alone, all men will believe on him, and the Romans shall come and take away both our place and nation. And one of them, named Caiaphas, being the high priest that same year, said unto them, You know nothing at all, nor consider that it is expedient for us that one man should die for the people, and that the whole nation perish not. Well, that's interesting, isn't it? If we let him alone, all men will believe on him, and the Romans shall come and take away both our place and our nation. We've seen over the last 20 years the lengths the authorities will go to ensure national security. From the perspective of the Jewish authorities trying to keep a lid on public order so that the Romans wouldn't step in and take direct control, Jesus represented a serious threat to national security. That's what's being said here, isn't it? It's about national security. The moment we realize this, and the febrile atmosphere under which all of this was played out, the story in the Gospels make complete sense. So now we have to decide whether the rest of this could possibly be true. Matthew chapter 26 and verse 47. And while he yet spake, lo, Judas, one of the 12, came, and with him a great crowd with swords and staves, and the chief priests and the elders of the city, of the people. And in that same hour said Jesus to the multitudes, Are you come out as against a thief with swords and staves, for to take me? I sat daily with you teaching in the temple, and you laid no hold on me. But all of this was done that the scriptures of the prophets might be fulfilled. Then all the disciples forsook him and fled. And they that had laid hold on Jesus led him away to Caiaphas, the high priest, where the scribes and the elders were assembled. So, according to Matthew, Jesus was arrested by night, under the cover of darkness, tried and then put to death, even though he was an innocent man. His band of disciples all fled and abandoned him. Verse 56, then all the disciples forsook him and fled. They are not heroes in this story, and that shouldn't surprise us. Their worldview had been shattered. They were hoping that in the decisive moment that Jesus would reveal himself as the Messiah that they had all been waiting for. Is that what Judas Iscariot thought? That's what Jesus would do. Matthew 27 and verse 55. And many women were there beholding afar off, which followed Jesus from Galilee, ministering unto him, among which was Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James and Joseph, Mary the mother of Zebedee's children. When the even was come, there came a rich man of Arimathea named Joseph, who also himself was Jesus' disciple, he went to Pilate and begged the body of Jesus. Then Pilate commanded the body be delivered. And when Joseph had taken the body, he wrapped it in a clean linen cloth and laid it in his own tomb, which was hewn out in the rock, and rolled a great stone to the door of the sepulchre and departed. And there was Mary Magdalene and the other Mary sitting over the sepulchre. So the disciples are not the heroes in this story. You know, they didn't have this incredible belief. You know, they all forsook him and fled. But it is, by contrast, a group of courageous women, the mothers of the disciples and Mary Magdalene, who actually stay with Jesus until the end. Okay, which is very interesting, isn't it? It's actually the women who found the courage, actually, to be with Jesus right until the end, not his own male disciples. Matthew 27 and verse 62. Now the next day that followed the day of the preparation, the chief priests and the Pharisees came together unto Pilate, saying, Sir, we remember that deceiver said, while he was yet alive, after 3 days I will rise again. Command, therefore, the sepulchre be made sure until the third day, lest his disciples come by night and steal him away, and say unto the people, he is risen from the dead, so the last error shall be worse than the first. Pilate said unto them, You have a watch, go your way, make it as sure as you can. So they went and made the sepulchre sure, sealing the stone and setting a watch. In contrast, and there's the irony, that you've got the disciples who all abandoned Jesus, forsook him and fled. You've got a group of women courageously who stayed with Jesus right until the end and, you know, take his body and, you know, they see where he was buried. I mean, Joseph of Arimathea took the body, but they see where Jesus is buried. And now you have this. You have the attitude of the Jewish authorities, who were obviously jittery about Jesus's claims about rising from the dead, even if the disciples had had their worldview shattered. Right? We remember what that deceiver said while he was yet alive. After 3 days, I will rise again. The authorities were not going to take any chances, okay, with this. So they set a guard and they sealed the tomb, which is interesting, I think, and ironic when you compare it to the attitude of the disciples. So now we come to the central question. Did Jesus overcome death by rising again? Over the years, there have been many alternative theories as to what happened to the body of Jesus. And here is a list of those alternatives. That the disciples went to the wrong tomb on the morning of the resurrection. They got a bit confused and they said, oh, tomb is empty, Jesus is risen from the dead. Or that the Roman and Jewish authorities removed the body, that Joseph of Arimathea might have removed the body, that Jesus somehow revived in the tomb, that the disciples stole the body of Jesus. And I'd like to suggest actually there was possibly another possibility as well, which we'll come to later. So now we come to the central question. Did Jesus rise from the dead? Okay. These were the possibilities that people have thought about over the years. But it's interesting, isn't it, that in Matthew 28, this is verse 11, this is what is said. Now, when they were going, this is the watch, okay, some of the watch came into the city and showed unto the chief priests all the things that were done. Now, this is the resurrection. And when they were assembled with the elders and had taken counsel, they gave large money unto the soldiers, saying, Say ye, his disciples came by night and stole him away while we slept. And if this comes to the governor's ear, we will persuade him and secure you. So they took the money and did as they were taught. And this saying is commonly reported among the Jews until this day. The question as to what happened to the body of Jesus has been long debated over the last 2,000 years. Of course, there have been several alternative theories to the resurrection claim, but the only credible one that was accepted at the time by the brightest people in Jerusalem was that his disciples stole the body. So we can ignore all the other alternatives. The only one that was accepted at the time as being credible was that his disciples stole the body. All the other alternatives were dismissed by the smartest people in Jerusalem, and they were smart. The question is that counterclaim credible? Is that counterclaim that Jesus didn't rise from the dead, and in fact the disciples stole the body, is that credible? And why would the authorities, verse 12 and 13, hand over cash if Jesus's disciples had stolen the body? You wouldn't need to hand over cash for that, you know. Why would you hand over cash if it were true? The idea of one rising from the dead is so palpably ridiculous. Why would you have to bribe the gods to say it didn't happen? Unless, of course, it did. There's the thing, isn't there? Mark chapter 16. Now, when Jesus was risen early the first day of the week, he appeared first to Mary Magdalene, out of whom he had cast 7 devils. She went and told them that had been with him, as they mourned and wept. And they, when they had heard that he was alive and had been seen of her, said, "That's fantastic. That's amazing. Jesus is risen from the dead. Whoopee, fantastic." Well, no, Mark doesn't say that, does he? Mark says, they didn't believe. They, when they heard that he was alive and had been seen of her, believed not. After that, he appeared in another form to 2 of them as they walked and went into the country. And they went and told the residue. Neither believed they then. Afterward, he appeared unto the 11 as they sat at meat and upbraided them with their unbelief and hardness of heart, because they believed not them which had seen him after he was risen. The irony was that it was Jesus's disciples who found it hard to believe that Jesus had been raised from the dead. There's the irony. The authorities may have been jittery about it, but the disciples actually found it very difficult to believe. Okay, so we looked at a number of alternatives as to what might have happened to the body of Jesus, and we said the only one that was accepted at the time was the idea that the disciples had stolen the body. But later, there actually emerged another theory, because it was so obvious that something had happened. And it's here in John chapter 20, verse 24. But Thomas, one of the 12, called Didymus, was not with them when Jesus came. And the other disciples therefore said unto him, "We've seen the Lord." But he said unto them, "Except I shall see in his hands the print of the nails, and put my finger into the print of the nails, and thrust my hand into his side, I will not believe." There was one alternative to the resurrection that the authorities overlooked at the time. And this little detail gives the ring of truth to the claim that Jesus rose from the dead. Thomas Didymus, or Doubting Thomas, has become a byword for skepticism. But this detail, recalled in John's Gospel, and remember that the Gospels are like strata. They tell us where the church was at that particular time. This detail, recalled in John's Gospel, written later than the other Gospel accounts of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, betrays an interesting detail. Why did Thomas doubt? Modern translations, of course, make this a lot easier to understand, because Didymus means twin. Thomas's skepticism is well founded because he was a twin and knew how easy it was to trick people. But when the earlier Gospels were written, their writers did not think to include this detail because it added nothing to their account of the resurrection. Yes, they knew that Thomas was a twin and that he doubted, but at the time, no one seriously was arguing that Jesus had an identical twin. By the time that John's Gospel was written, the evidence for the resurrection was so overwhelming that the only alternative now was to argue that Jesus had an identical twin. Thomas doesn't just want to look at Jesus. He wants to put his fingers into the marks of his body. He wants to make sure. He's not doubting Thomas. He's testing Thomas. 1 Corinthians 15 and verse 3. Back to where we started. "For I delivered unto you, first of all, that which I also received, how that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he rose again the 3rd day according to the Scriptures, that he was seen of Cephas, then of the 12. After that, he was seen of above 500 brethren at once, of whom the greater part remain unto this present, but some have fallen asleep. After that, he was seen of James, then of all the apostles, and last of all, he was seen of me also, as one born out of due time. How many people saw the risen Christ? According to Paul, it was over 500. For those disciples who originally forsook Jesus and fled, the resurrection event changed their lives. There was a profound change, wasn't there? They were not the heroes of the story, were they? But after the resurrection, after Jesus had appeared to them, the resurrection event changed those men. They went from being water, they became wine, to use that metaphor from John's Gospel. They were never the same again. Many of them would go on and give their lives to what they'd witnessed. And of course, it changed Paul's life. Not one of the 12, not one of his band of disciples from rural Galilee, but a sophisticated Hellenized Jew and a staunch opponent of this Jewish sect. But something profound happened to Paul that completely turned his life around. And it can change ours too. God's view of our problems is different to ours, as I was saying before. The life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ demonstrates that. You need to find out more. This is the start of a journey. Jesus is good news, the best news, and the biggest news. Thank you for listening.